Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism. And what better place to talk about the 7 deadly sins? Be curious if any of you know them by heart. I didn't. I had to do a big research on this to figure out what the 7 deadly sins were. So let's talk about them. So this video idea kind of came up when I was sort of stuck in an airport and then my flight was delayed and then I was daydreaming and started thinking about the 7 deadly sins. Then I started reading about them. Now the 7 deadly sins were originally laid out in the Catholic religious canon, but have sort of entered all Western thought. So again, I studied them. And it turns out that historically, these 7 deadly sins are viewed as sort of predispositions for bad behavior. But I have to say, as I read about the 7 deadly sins, I felt like I was reading about a 1500 to 2000 year old description of narcissism. So let's take a tour of these because it's really quite striking. The 7 deadly sins almost reads like an ancient DSM. Okay, so if you want to play along, I want you to think about the key narcissistic relationships in your life. And as I say each sin, check off the ones that this person has. I wouldn't be surprised if they have all 7. So the first deadly sin is pride. A read on what they meant by pride is that in this taxonomy is that pride was arrogance and is sort of the mothership of all other sins. It's hubris. And you can imagine that religious folks didn't like that because a person who had pride thought they were above the rules and they really liked rules back then. Now, when we think about this in the context of narcissism, pride is everything, right? It may be one of the key governing qualities, this idea of arrogance and also entitlement, that the rules don't apply to them, that they are somehow above everything. The counterweight, or if you will, the opposite to pride, is humility. And ironically, humility is a key element of agreeableness, which is the opposite of antagonism. The second deadly sin is greed or covetousness. The sort of religious framing around this is coveting or taking more than what you need, right? Greedy people covet stuff and they want what other people have. For greedy people, no matter how much they get, it's never enough. Now, greed is a central core issue of narcissism. Narcissistic people are covetous, competitive, and they don't like not being in power, and stuff and money and all the rest of it are a source of that power. And that greed never really dissipates for narcissistic people. The third deadly sin is lust. It's sort of the sex addiction of the 5th century. Lust is consistent with this idea of unfettered desire. And it kind of overlaps with covetousness because lust, in this definition of a sin, is giving in to your desire or want anytime you want it. The belief was that people who had lust were more likely to engage in behaviors that way back then were considered immoral. Now, if we were to take this idea of lust into modern times, we would see that lust lays the groundwork for what we call dysregulated sexual behavior, regardless of how it affects other people. Back in the day, lust was considered to not be as serious a sin as something like pride. But when we connect it to narcissism, it sort of tracks, right? Narcissism is correlated with obsessive, dysregulated sexual behavior, and narcissism is also associated with sex addiction. Like I said, which it seems like what they were talking about when they were talking about lust in the 5th century, they were kind of talking about sex addiction. The 4th deadly sin is envy. And the grand irony here is that envy is actually part of the modern DSM criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. Now, envy builds onto greed, covetousness, and lust. It's not just the wanting. It's the wanting what someone else has. Social media, right? Interestingly, ancient conceptions of envy talk about various steps in the process of envy, such as harming the reputation of the person who has what you want. Then it is about schadenfreude, or being happy when something bad happens to the person that you envy. Narcissistic people not only envy other people, but they often believe that other people envy them. So envy is a guiding construct of narcissism. The fifth deadly sin is gluttony. This is a deadly sin that's related to overconsumption. This sin typically was talking about food, and the implication was that by a person overeating, that meant someone else was lacking. Someone was eating more food than one needed, another person was going hungry. And keep in mind, these sins were written at a time of far greater food scarcity. But again, you can see a theme here. Gluttony also takes in the territories such as covetousness, greed, and lust. And it has a sort of lack of empathy built in, a person eating and eating when others are hungry. It's sort of an obsessiveness about food and food experiences. Like nowadays it would be like, I have to go to the fancy restaurant kind of thing. Now, while gluttony in and of itself, I don't think it's an indicator of narcissism, unrepentant appetites for whatever the narcissistic person wants is very much a part of gluttony. And in some ways, the modern take on gluttony is the need to be at the hot new restaurant, eating the best new thing, and of course, posting about it. It's more of the wanting more and needing more and having better than what other people are consuming and doing it without reflection on whether others are having enough. So it's sort of overconsumption meets lack of empathy. That's sort of what gluttony is. The sixth deadly sin is sloth. Now here is where it gets really interesting. These deadly sin people were really onto something, because sloth is where the concept of vulnerable narcissism actually gets captured really well. I traditionally thought of sloth as laziness. And while that is part of it, apparently it's way more. It's sort of an apathy, lack of empathy, limited range of emotion, lack of motivation, only caring for the self and not anybody else. Slothy people are sort of negligent, late, and sort of chronically victimized. It's freaking vulnerable narcissism. It was amazing. As I read this, I was like, what? This means that folks back then were observing this phenomenon. There were these sullen, petulant, passive-aggressive folks that were walking around at that time, and they called it sloth. And obviously the churchy folks believed strongly in a work ethic, and folks who don't work hard were considered sort of sinner-ish. But this sloth thing really captures all the apathetic, victimized, and aggrieved stuff that comprises vulnerable narcissism. This sense that they cannot be bothered to do anything good. And the seventh and final deadly sin is wrath. Wrath is not just anger. It's also vindictiveness. It's a really interesting framing, because the deadly sin people actually weren't mad about anger. What they were saying that anger becomes a sin when the target of the anger is an innocent person, when that anger is disproportionate, when that anger is punitive, and that anger is unrelenting. Sound familiar? It's exactly the kind of anger we witness in narcissism, which is reactive, vengeance-oriented, punitive, and never seems to abate. There's that shame-rage spiral. So yes, the 7 deadly sins did come out of a religious canon, of a religious structure. And a lot of these sins are about people being unrestrained. The words we psychology folks use is dysregulated. And certainly, one could make the argument that the 7 deadly sins were a form of social control, that a person who lived outside the lines would be branded a sinner. But when you dive deeper into what was written about these sins, folks like Thomas Aquinas and folks like this wrote about it. It wasn't healthy pride, but arrogance. It wasn't eating good food. It was feasting while others were starving. So, okay, back to modern 2023 times. What does this tell us? Because the question I get from a lot of people is this narcissism thing new? Well, obviously not. An entire religious system and a few popes and other religious scholars saw it fit to write their system of sins around the exact characteristics that comprise narcissism. Lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, rage, arrogance, vindictiveness, envy, covetousness, greed. I actually thought vanity was a deadly sin. I gave myself a quiz and I said vanity, but apparently it's a more minor sin. But it's all there, which means historically, human beings have seen this as a problem. But we never really figured it out. I guess back then, they thought people might get the sins punished out of them. We know that that's not true. But what we did know, always knew, is that it's not good for us. And it never will be. Hold on to your hats, because we're going to be doing a video coming up on the 7 sacred virtues. And those are going to teach you and help you see the qualities that really line up with who gets the most hurt by the narcissistic folks. So no, narcissism is not a new game. It has obviously been around since there have been people. But it's only recently that we have identified it as a real clinical issue, and really only very, 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 very recently that we've identified it as an issue for other people. It's not as simple as sin or the devil or anything like that, but it's a problem. And while we will clearly never eradicate it, we can perfect our coping and ground game so we can figure out the workarounds and avoid it whenever possible. Thanks again.